Hi, welcome everyone. This is Yoan, and in this episode, I would love to share quilt binding tutorial. Every now and then, I've got questions from some of you about how to bind quilt. Apparently, some of you are very new in the quilting and want to know more detail. Obviously, there are many methods of binding, and there is really no right or wrong way of doing it. It's just a matter of preference. Now, in this particular video, I'm going to show you my favorite binding method. This is the method that I use pretty much most of the time for most of my quilts. So I hope you enjoy this tutorial and you get to learn something out of this, and let's jump straight into it. So I'm gonna use this little quilt sampler for this particular demonstration. My quilt is measuring 20.5 inch by 20.5 inch, and this fabric will be my binding fabric. So we're gonna cut 2.5 inch strips from the width of the fabric. To determine how many strips we will need to cut, we're gonna do just a little bit of math. So what you wanna do, you wanna measure the perimeter of your quilt. So in this case, my quilt is measuring 20.5 inch by 20.5 inch. So the perimeter of my quilt is 82 inches. From your quilt perimeter, you wanna add 15, which is extra fabric for the corners and overlap. And then divide that number to 42, which is the average width of the fabric of cotton quilting fabric. After I've done my math, I've got a number of 2.3. So I'm going to go ahead and round up this number to the next number, which is 3, meaning I will need 3 strips for my binding. So whichever number that you get, always round it up to the next number, because it is better to have more binding than less. So I'm going to go ahead and cut 3 2.5 inch strips from this fabric. I folded my fabric in half widthwise on grain line where the two selvage ends are touching each other, and I'm gonna use this 24-inch long ruler to cut my fabric. Now if you don't have such a long ruler, you can try fold the fabric in half again, just like that. Just try to keep all the edges straight so you are cutting on the grain line. First, I'm going to straighten up the edges, so I'm going to trim off about 1/2 inch, so I will have clean edges to start cutting my strips. Now I'm going to go ahead and measure 2.5 inch. So I'm aligning the edges of my fabric with the 2.5 inch point of the ruler, and then cut. And voila, my first strip is done. So I'm going to go ahead and cut 2 more strips as per what I need. Once you've cut all of your strips, we're going to go ahead and join them together. So what we're going to do, we're going to cross the strips right sides together, just like that. So the right sides of your fabric should be touching each other at this point. Leave a little bit of tails on both ends, about 1/2 inch, this way we can get rid of the selvage ends. Now take your ruler and then draw a diagonal line from this upper corner down to the opposite, just like so. Now you can pop a pin to secure them in place, then go ahead and stitch on that diagonal line. Now you can trim off the excess fabric about 1/4 inch away from the seam line, and also trim off these excess corner fabrics. Alright, so you should end up with something like this. Now you can go ahead and open the seams and then give this a quick pressing. Join all the remaining strips in the very same method. Once you've joined all the strips together, you want to hop over to your ironing board, fold your binding strip in half lengthwise, just like so, and then press. Do this all the way to the other end, and that's it. Our binding strip is ready to go now. Now if your binding is super long, you may want to roll your binding strip. You can use a piece of cardboard, or you can use a small ruler like what I do here. This will keep your binding in place so it's not going to be all over the place or getting tangled or dirty. Now we're ready to start binding. So go ahead and take your binding strip, position that on one of the sides of your quilt, somewhere at the center point. Align the raw edges of the quilt with the raw edges of the binding. If you've got a rectangle quilt, you may want to start at the longer side. Leave a little bit of extra binding for the overlapping later. So I would say about 6 to 10 inches depending on how big is your quilt. Now I'm going to clip at the starting point to hold the binding in place. Again, don't forget to leave a little bit of extra binding tail. And then go ahead and stitch along the edges with 1/4 inch of seam allowance. I recommend to use your walking foot since there is a lot of bulk here. As you are approaching the corner, slow down a little bit and then stop about 1/4 inch before the very end. Keep your needle down and then raise your presser foot. Now pivot your fabric at 45-degree angle, just like that. Lower your presser foot again and then continue stitching down to the end. So this is how the corner should look like. Fold your strip up towards the top, forming a 45-degree fold line over there, and then fold your strip back down. Of course, you want to keep all the edges aligned, just like so. And then we're going to continue stitching 1/4 inch down from the top edge all the way down. Again, sewing 1/4 inch down from the top edge right by the fold line, you know, the 45 degrees fold line underneath. And of course, you want to back stitch there. And then continue stitching, and then you want to repeat the same for all the corners. Now as you get to the same side from where you started, you want to stop sewing about 7 to 15 inches from the starting point. Again, it all matters how big your quilt is. The larger the distance is, the easier it is to work on the overlap. And here I've already attached my binding strip to all the sides of the quilt. Alright, now it's time to join these two strips together. I had to trim off a little bit of my extra binding from the beginning. It was a bit too long and this isn't such a large quilt, so I don't have much room to wiggle. Now, since our binding is 2.5 inches wide, we're going to overlap this by 2.5 inch. So always go by the width of your binding. So I'm gonna go ahead and overlap my strips. And I'm gonna take my ruler and then I'm gonna measure 2.5 inch from the edges of the lower strip. So here I'm aligning the edges of my ruler with the edges of the lower strip. And then I'm gonna use my fabric marker to mark the 2.5 inch point. And then extend the mark by making a straight line. And this is gonna be the cutting line. And then with your scissors, go ahead and cut on that 2.5 inch mark line. Now you want to open up the fold of your binding edges, just like that. And then you want to cross your binding strips, right sides together, almost the same way as we did when we joined the binding strips together. However, this time you want to align all the edges. So this may not be too intuitive at first, but when you get the hang of it, it's actually very easy. Now I'm going to take a pin and secure along the edges here to hold this in place. Alright, let me get a better view here so you can better understand me. So what we're going to do next, we're going to sew on diagonal angle from this upper corner down to the opposite. Now I'm going to grab my ruler and draw my diagonal seam line. Again, this is almost the same as we did when we joined our binding strips together. Only the position of the strips are kind of the opposite, but the same principle though. Alright, once you've drawn your seam line, if you are in doubt, you can do a little bit of assessing just to make sure that your binding isn't twisted. So go ahead and lay your strip flat without messing the pins and the mark. And see if everything looks alright and make sure there is no twist. Mine seems to be good right now. So I'm going to go ahead and clip the bottom gap again. This is just to make it easier to move and maneuver the strips. And then go ahead and stitch right on the marked seam line. And once you've done that, go ahead and trim off the excess binding about 1/4 inch away from the seam line. Then finger press the seams open, and there you go. The edges of your binding has been joined together. Now you can go ahead and continue stitching to finish attaching the binding. Now fold your binding towards the back of your quilt. So your binding should be hugging the edges of your quilt now. And then go ahead and clip. And then continue clipping every a couple of inches or so. The corner area should look nicely mitered, just like this. Now to clip this, I'm going to show you from the back side of the quilt. So you want to fold the binding, forming the mitered corner as well at the back. Should be quite intuitive at this point. Just like that. Now let's go ahead and clip this in place. There you go. Here I've already secured my binding. Now I'm going to flip this to the back side. And we're going to finish up the binding with hand stitching. So go ahead and prepare your hand stitching needle and the thread. You can use cotton or polyester. Ideally, the color of your thread should be matching the color of your binding. So I'm going to go ahead and measure this thread up to my elbow and then cut. Now I'm going to thread my needle. I like to coat my thread with this beeswax before I start sewing to prevent the thread from tangling. Make a knot at the end of your thread. You can start sewing pretty much at any side. So I like to start stitching from the inside of the quilt. Just make an angle there. So I'm going to poke from here and then bring my needle back up right below the seam line and then pull through. This way the knot is hidden inside the binding. Now when you do this, you want to make sure that you are not poking through the right side of the quilt. So on the right side, everything should look nice and clean. Now if you want, before you start stitching, you can make another knot just to make everything extra secured. You don't have to though, it's optional. Alright, so I had to do several attempts with my camera work to get a good angle where you can actually understand what I'm doing here. So what you want to do, you want to insert your needle into the fold of the binding, grab a little bit of fabric from there, and then pull the thread through. Now grab the backing fabric right underneath the binding, making sure that you are not poking all the way through the front side of your quilt, and then pull the thread through. Now you want to grab a little bit of the binding again, and pull the thread through, and then grab the backing fabric again, and pull the thread through. Again, you want to make sure that you are not stitching through the front of the quilt, so everything should be nice and clean at the front. So you want to keep repeating this motion, alternating the binding and the backing. Try keeping the distance consistent. As you get to the corner, you want to slip your needle all the way up to the mitered fold, just like so. And from there you want to go ahead and make your way down. With the same method, try to do it with smaller distance. This way the corners are tightly sewn. As you start to running out of the thread, you can stop stitching. So go ahead and make a knot and then tighten it up. And then slip your needle into the quilt. Again, making sure you are not poking through the front side of your quilt. And then pull your needle through. Now pull the thread slightly. Just create a little bit of tension there. And then cut. So repeat the same all around. This is a great way to put on a nice movie or TV show or listening to your favorite audiobook or podcast. And before you know it, your quilt is done and the result is nice and clean and really worth the effort that you put into it. And that's about it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed already, please click that subscribe button below so you won't miss any future upload. And I shall see you next time with another fun sewing and quilting projects. Goodbye.